Colleagues, please take your places. We appreciate all of you, all the witnesses being here today. We have Mr. Denis Pilon, Professor Denis Pilon du département.
Professor Denis Pilon from the Political Sciences faculty at York University.
Jonathan Rose, Associate Professor, Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, and then from the Institut sur la Gouvernance.
And from the Institute on Governance, we have Marie-Antoinette Flumian.
Sorry we're a bit late. We had some housekeeping matters that we had to take care of, but we're very anxious to hear what you have to say. So the way it works is that you each, as you know, will be presenting for 10 minutes. And then we typically have 2 rounds of questioning where in each round every member gets a chance to ask questions. We'll figure out the timing of each round, but typically it's 5 minutes. The first round will be 5 minutes, I think. We'll figure out the math, but because we're going to end at 12:15, where we've extended our meeting 15 minutes because we got started late. And I'd just like to mention one thing. The 5 minutes that each member has covers questions and answers. So it's something that everyone should keep in mind, the members and the witnesses, that if there's a long preamble to a question, it leaves less time for answers. And if you are not able to answer, if there's a question hanging out there, like somebody's asked a question and then the 5 minutes is up, you can still address the issue the next time you have a chance to speak. So it doesn't mean you can't follow up on the question, but it would have to be at another opportunity, maybe when you're answering another question or what have you. So we'll start with Professor Pilon for 10 minutes, please.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me to come, and I want to begin by applauding the government for bringing this issue forward and for the parties that are supporting it. All right, a little bit about me. I've worked on this topic for almost 3 decades. I've written 2 books on the topic and many research papers. My research is focused on real-world experience and results with different voting systems and the historical and contemporary processes of reforming political institutions like voting systems. Now, I've also researched related topics on voter registration, voter turnout, youth participation, the representation of social diversity, and Canadian democratization more broadly. And I also have some practical experience in organizing elections as a former deputy district electoral officer in British Columbia, actually the deputy. So it meant I was second in charge of organizing a riding for the purposes of a provincial election, hiring 300 people, training them to do the election day stuff. So I have a little bit of practical insight as well as academic insight into voting systems. Now, we've heard from many people that there is no perfect voting system, but that doesn't mean there aren't imperfect ones, like first past the post, particularly from a democratic point of view. We call our system a representative democracy, but first past the post fails to represent effectively. It misrepresents the popular support for parties. It leaves over half the voters contributing to the election of no one. It typically results in minority of voters dominating majorities. It limits political competition. I mean, with such lousy representation, how democratic can the system be? And the reason for that is that the system was not designed to be democratic. Its origins are in the pre-democratic era, and it's been kept in place for electoral self-interest. Canadians have struggled to make their system democratic despite these institutional barriers. Proportional representation systems, by contrast, were designed to represent voters effectively, even if the vote motives of reformers were not always democratic. Now, my brief that I've submitted to the committee argues that the way we talk about reform tends to structure the debate that follows, and we've seen 3 views emerge since this process started. One frames the question as an issue of the Constitution and the need for a referendum. Another argues that voting systems are just a matter of taste, just depends what you like, what you prefer. And the last argues that voting systems are quintessentially a matter of democratic reform, and I argue that only the last view is really credible. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of the brief. I just want to sketch out the broad themes, and I can certainly expand on any of these issues in the question and answer period. On the constitutional arguments, there are no merit to these. We've seen a range of views from the uninformed to the ridiculous, and the rapidity with which they are appearing in the media signals a kind of desperation from the right-wing think tanks that are sponsoring them. The referendum arguments are often clothed in a veneer of democratic rhetoric, but they are also weak and contradictory. Normatively, referendums should be restricted to situations where voters can become reasonably informed to be able to participate in the discussions. Canadian provincial referendums and voting systems have shown this not to be possible. Referendum advocates would have us believe that they will lead to reasoned debates and decisions on this question, but evidence suggests otherwise. The research on referendums, both Canadian and comparative, shows that the way that voters deal with issue complexity is to reject the process entirely. So when people have rejected different options, it's often because they have no clue what they're being asked. In many cases, they didn't even know a referendum was going on. The referendum arguments are themselves internally inconsistent. We are led to believe that we must have at least a majority to change our voting system, but a government that represents 39% of the population is okay to make all the decisions in the interim. Why a majority for one question but not the other? It seems to me that if a majority is the ultimate test of decision-making, then it should be applied in all democratic situations. And finally, as I will spell out in a moment, I think this issue is one of voter equality, and you don't put equality rights to a vote. Now on to the idea that voting systems are a matter of competing values and outcome preferences, a matter of taste. There's two key problems with this argument. First of all, voters are not well informed about any of our political institutions and thus do not really have tastes about them. For instance, in two different surveys done 10 years apart, voters were asked if a majority government reflected a majority of the Canadian population, and they argued, yes, it did. A majority of them said, yes, it does, when in fact I think everybody here knows they almost never do. Voters cope with political complexity through proxies, the parties they support. When a party complains about something, then the public usually wants answers. If a party is fine with things, then the voters are usually fine. I think it's foolish to pretend otherwise. Voters have fairly informed views about the broad themes of politics they prefer, but the details and the institutions are unavoidably an elite process. The other problem with voting systems as a matter of taste is that it flattens out the values and makes them all equal, when in fact I think we should privilege democratic choices and disallow undemocratic ones. The problem with making a choice for majority governments as a value is that it suggests that that's okay. It's okay for a minority of people to impose their views on the majority. I just don't see how you can make that a democratic argument. I mean, there's lots of arguments in favor of our system, they're just not democratic ones. So instead of looking at voting systems as a matter of choice, where all choices are equal, we need to judge our voting systems against what Canadians are trying to do with their voting system. And in this case, I think the evidence suggests that they are trying to get their political views represented. And so we need a system that will do that most effectively. Voting systems as democratic reform starts from a realistic sense of what voters are trying to do when they vote. And here we know from a mountain of evidence that voters vote party, as opposed to, say, voting for a local representative. Even when voters say they're voting for a local representative, we discover they're actually voting for the party. Yet in trying to get those party results, our current voting system privileges geography, though geography is not the basis in forming that vote. Thus, proximate voters, voters who live close to each other, are privileged by our system, and dispersed voters are discriminated against. This violates the voters' rights to have their votes count equally. And this issue actually affects all parties. Voters of all parties find themselves marooned in different parts of the country, unable to make common cause with voters who agree with the kinds of things they would like to see represented. This leads to wasted votes, distorted representation of parties, and typically a legislative majority government that a majority of Canadians do not actually support. This is wrong because it's undemocratic, it's unrepresentative, and violates some basic democratic notions of majority rule. Again, we do it this way not because of preferences or the Constitution, but because historically self-interested parties have kept it that way. Attempts to defend it involve contorted and convoluted arguments that, frankly, are unsupported by facts. So let me conclude. I would argue that this committee's job is to move forward and just recommend that the government change our voting system to a proportional system. And the only real barrier is political will. The government has a majority. We have a majority we have parties who represent a majority of Canadians whose parties supported this issue. I think there's plenty of reasons for the government to move forward. And here I would argue that the government shouldn't really worry about the critics, because I think the critics' arguments are mostly politically self-interested. We've had a number of commentators suggest that there will be public outrage if there is not a referendum, but frankly, the only people who are outraged are the ones who are writing such editorials. In moving forward, I think the government's voting system choice should be informed by facts, not speculation. And this is key because most discussion to date has focused on myth, distortion, and outright speculative made-up nonsense. There's plenty of real-world experience with proportional representation to draw from for us to understand how this would affect Canadian politics. But comparisons should be with countries that are comparable to Canada. In other words, Western Europe, New Zealand, not Italy and Israel, who are countries who have very distinct political histories and very different political situations than Canada. If we do that, if we take seriously an evidence-based approach, then just about every complaint about proportional representation can be shown to be without support. Whether we're talking about complexity, instability, too much stability, lack of local influence, etc., all these things can be shown to be without foundation. Also, we could spend some time talking about the many good things that change would bring in moving to a proportional system. We could highlight how a change to any proportional system would immediately increase political competition. It would lead to changes in voter turnout. It would lead to improvements in the representation of our diversity. And it would end the policy lurch that we see presently with our alternation in government. And I'm happy to expand on all these themes in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pilon. We'll go now to Professor Rose for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for inviting me to this committee. Like many Canadians, I've been following your crash course on electoral systems with great interest. As a political scientist who finds the topic as fascinating as it is complex, I've been really impressed with the facility with which the committee has understood the nuances of electoral systems and also methods of representation. As you're quickly realizing, it's complex and a bit like doing a Rubik's Cube. If you change one thing, the other things change as well. But unlike a Rubik's Cube, there is no right answer. This is important because if I were to summarize electoral systems in one word, I would say contingency. Your steep learning curve in some ways makes sense because you've heard from many of the experts on the subject. And therein lies an important conundrum. While I have no doubt that you will master the details of electoral systems, I wonder about the Canadian public. How will they learn? And what is it that they need to learn? I want to discuss the public learning component of electoral reform from my experience as academic director of the Ontario Citizens Assembly, and I want to stress the importance of that in the overall strategy of engagement. The other thing I wanted to do briefly was to talk about the large electoral signposts, and hope you keep that in mind so you're not distracted by the red herrings along the way. Public learning is really the flip side of democratic engagement. This reform exercise has created an ideal opportunity for a national conversation. We all want citizens to be engaged, but true engagement cannot occur without a solid foundation of knowledge. And we know that among citizens, the variation is very high, and as Professor Pilon just mentioned, the average is very low. Discussion should be about rational reason-giving, not emotional position-taking. And the former requires knowledge. Rational reason-giving was the basis of both the Ontario and the BC Citizens Assembly. That's how they worked. They understood that you could not choose an appropriate system without first understanding what principles were important to them. Canadians are not being asked to design a new electoral system, so I would say humbly there's no reason for them to argue for one or another. In my mind, that's the work of this committee. Where Canadians have an important role to play is to tell this committee and members of Parliament what are the values and principles that are important to them, and how are these evident in various systems. So your committee has been given 5 guiding principles, which I think are instructive. But they're not as clear as they might be, and I might suggest refinement about what they mean or at least be sure that you're using the language in the same way as others. For example, some of your principles your committee is working under are about outcomes, things like integrity and legitimacy. These are not created by a system, but are a product of them. Others are goals a system should embody, such as effectiveness, inclusiveness, whereas others relate to the mechanics of the system, how it works, local representation. Your principle of accessibility suggests the principle of simplicity, with its language, quote, "The proposed measure would avoid undue complexity." Simplicity, I might add, was one of the principles chosen by the Ontario Citizens' Assembly. And if I can paraphrase Albert Einstein, a good electoral system should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. There are other principles not listed that have been used by other studies. Voter choice, chosen by both the Ontario and BC Citizens' Assembly, was an important one for citizens, but curiously does not appear as frequently in the academic literature as the others. This suggests that citizens think about electoral systems differently than experts. That's worth remembering as you hear from experts about their opinions about what's important. Other studies have also refined what effectiveness really means. Does it mean effective parties, as British Columbia and Ontario defined it? Does it mean effective parliament, as the Ontario Assembly refined it? Or does it mean effective government, as defined both by the Law Reform Commission and the New Brunswick Commission? So I would suggest it'll be really important for you to clarify these so that both MPs and citizens are clear on what it is they value and whether they're talking about the same thing. In the Ontario Citizens' Assembly process, $6 million was devoted to educating voters. A strong, robust educational campaign is more than advertising, of course, and this government has taken the useful first step of producing a consultation guide. I would take exception to one of your previous witnesses who characterized your process as an elite pleasure industry. I actually think this matters, and if so, surely more is needed to both persuade the public and provide basic educations about how these principles you've been given resonate, but also to inform citizens once this committee reports in December. And frankly, this is even more significant if and when a referendum occurs. Let me shift gears quickly and talk about electoral systems. You've heard a lot about them, but I think that one way to think about it is the big debate in which they occur. Scholars like to talk about whether they are causes, they create greater participation, they create more parties, they create different kinds of parties, or whether they are effects. They're a product of a political culture. They're a product of regionalism, or perhaps institutional context. In reality, they are both. Electoral systems both illuminate and reflect. In the literature, we classify electoral systems by these two large categories that might help in your deliberation: output and mechanics. So for output, we're thinking about proportional versus non-proportional systems, the big categories. But to determine what serves our need best, we need to go back to our principles. Do we want a system that increases the chance of a strong majority government? Do we want increased diversity in Parliament? Do we want increased number of political parties? Those are all questions which force us to go back to those principles. The second approach is to think about mechanics. How does the electoral system work, and what's its relationship to the output? When scholars discuss mechanics, they're usually talking about three things. First, how do voters mark their preferences? Do they rank them or do they make a choice? Ranking offers greater choice, but it might surprise you that sometimes ranking doesn't affect the outcome of the choice. A categorical choice is simple, but may not reflect preferences accurately. The second issue you're facing in mechanics is how many representatives do you want per district? One allows for simple accountability, but can't be proportional. As you increase the number in each district, you do increase, perhaps, proportionality. But you perhaps may sacrifice connection between the representatives and constituents. Moreover, you may sacrifice local representation. These are trade-offs which need to be carefully weighed. The third element of the mechanics is the formula, and you've talked about this in the last few days. Whether you have a plurality formula, and the formula is basically, how do you decide who won? The plurality formula is simple, as you know. a majority formula ensures that there's legitimacy. A proportional system ensures that vote share equals seat share, but may sacrifice local representation. A mixed system offers what some might say is the best of both worlds, but it does create two classes of MPs. So I want to reinforce the model of Ontario and BC Citizens' Assembly. It was based on deliberation, not consultation. It's not enough to ask people for their opinions when doing so may only reinforce their existing beliefs. There needs to be an honest and robust public learning campaign that establishes connections between these principles and others, and how they correspond to the kind of representation you want. The conversation here and in the public has put, I would argue, the electoral cart before the horse. It has emphasized the product of those values, the electoral system, and not their trade-offs. So let me leave you with a final thought. While Professor Pilon and others have argued that there is no one perfect system, I want to quote Richard Katz, who argued that there is a perfect system. He argued the best electoral system, quote, depends on who you are, and where you want to go. At this stage, rather than focusing on systems, I hope you give these three some significant thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Rose will now go to Ms. Marie Antoinette Flumin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished chair, vice chairs, and members of the committee. First, I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the Institute on Governance and our work in advancing better governance in Canada and abroad. The IOG, as we call ourselves, is an independent, not-for-profit public interest institution that advances a better understanding and practices of good governance in Canada at the federal, provincial, municipal levels with Indigenous governments, not-for-profit organizations, and over the last 26 years, we've worked in 35 countries around the world. For us, governance is concerned with the governance ecosystem, the frameworks, the strategies, how decisions important to a society, a community, and an organization are taken, and fundamentally, how accountability is rendered. Our work is guided by 5 principles that mirror the ones that that are guiding the work of this group. We deal with legitimacy and voice, direction, performance, accountability, and fairness. And as I said, these are mirrored in the work that you were doing. This committee has been asked to identify and conduct a study of viable alternative voting systems to replace the first-past-the-post system, as well as to examine mandatory voting and online voting. To assist you in addressing these, my remarks will address 3 broad domains: why voting matters, how votes are counted, and how citizens vote. I'll discuss the governance considerations I believe this committee should assess as they move forward, and I will talk about the first and the third domain, that is, why voting matters and how citizens vote in conjunction. For the second part, I'd like to clarify that my comments will not be on the merits of a particular electoral system, as I will leave that to the experts in the field that you have already invited to speak and that are speaking this morning. En commençant par la fin, I would like to start with the issue of encouraging voter participation, specifically through such measures as mandatory voting and online voting. I propose this order because I think voter engagement is as big an issue for democratic legitimacy as the selection of a specific electoral process. Bien que je ne sois pas opposée en principe.
Even though in principle I'm not against mandatory voting, I believe that such use of public power should be envisaged only as a last resort in order to deal with low voter turnout. Fairly few support mandatory voting as a political principle, with the end that this brings with it a duty to vote, and that duty should be complied with the full force of the law. Only about 20 countries have mandatory voting. Of those, only half effectively enforce penalties.
Voting is principally to raise the voting participation and thereby improve the legitimacy of elected representatives. And a broadened legitimacy of elected representatives ensured broadened legitimacy of governments, which is a most laudable public objective. There are also a number of other measures that could be implemented prior to mandatory voting in order to improve voter turnout over time. Taking the prescriptive that the administration of voting is simply another element of government service delivery to the citizen, would, in my view, go a long way in bringing its design within a modern philosophy of citizen-centered government service. Simply put, if voting is more user-friendly and highly accessible, more people may be likely to vote. Everything possible should be done to facilitate voting, from registration to the actual act of voting. With modern information technologies, many impediments to voting or that make voting more difficult could be lifted or greatly reduced. For example, we have a permanent electronic national voters list. If only it were available at all polling stations across the country in real time. And this is a no-brainer in this day and age. We might have a vote anywhere policy that would facilitate the exercise of the franchise, notably by students who leave their permanent place of residence to attend college or university just around election time if we stick to the current cycle. People could vote wherever they are on polling day rather than having to return to their place of registration or having to change their registration to their new residence in order to be able to vote on polling day. The lifting of such administrative burdens might give a particular boost to voting in marginalized groups in Canada who may benefit from an increase in accessibility to voting. And amongst youth, since it's critical to retain the large increase in first-time young voters in the last federal election so that they continue over their lives to perform their civic duty, and I say this well understanding that in rural and remote areas of this country, we do not yet have the standard of connectivity to be found in the rest of the country. But perfection should not be the enemy of the good. We can start to work at modern-day solutions in full recognition of this reality and hope that we can implement something in rural and remote Canada as well. Another example is limiting vouching to one per person. This has brought an undue restriction on the administrative flexibility of the voting process that may have had an impact, in particular for elderly voters and seniors residents, where it was customary for staff to vouch for several residents who lacked identification, and in Indigenous communities. Stopping this practice may have been a remedy to a non-problem. But I would suggest more importantly that the ability to vote online would make a difference as well. We manage polling pretty much as we did 100 years ago, except for the permanent voters list that is composed and updated electronically with data input from the Canada Revenue Agency. Our voting process is entirely paper-based and very similar to what it was in the early 20th century. Polling stations do not have electronic access to the existing voters lists and have only a printed list of voters for their poll on which they cross off names as people come in and vote. Voters are given a ballot. You know the process. I don't need to go into it. It's extremely slow, and with the new additions that have been added to the administrative process, slow and clumsy for our day and age. To quote another Canadian, after all, this is 2016. Many service providers at all levels of government and in the private sector, even banks for heaven's sakes, don't let their customers wait in line or their citizens wait in line this way because they know that oftentimes this causes them to lose their patronage. They've taken the turn to modernity. The electoral process has not. People line up and wait to exercise their franchise at polling stations. A survey commissioned by us at the Institute on Governance, but not yet published, but I will make it available to the committee after my appearance, shows that Canadians widely endorse online voting. I believe that technology that could and must ensure both the confidentiality and integrity of an online voting process must be aggressively explored, now while we still have a few years to go. Citizens now live their lives online through their mobile devices. Few remember life without Google, and Google is just a decade old. Yet antiquated paper-based electoral processes already feel like an aberration in this world. People live their lives online, do their banking online, pay their taxes online, but they can't vote online. A younger generation does not understand this, and frankly, neither do I. I say let Canada be at the vanguard of piloting, experimenting, and implementing online voting as quickly as possible. By the way, under the Fair Elections Act, this would require the authorization of Parliament, and I quote Section 18(1) of the Canada Elections Act. The Chief Electoral Officer may carry out studies on voting, including studies respecting alternative voting processes, and may devise and test an alternative voting process for future use in a general election or by-election. Such a process may not be used for an official vote without the prior approval of the committees of the Senate and the House of Commons that normally consider electoral matters, or in the case of alternative electronic voting processes, without the prior approval of the Senate and the House of Commons. This is a very, very high bar that I have no doubt discourages the serious examination and investigation of these modern administrative matters that affect the democratic franchise. Most importantly, because an increase in voter turnout can equate to government's legitimacy, Methods to improve accessibility are but one of the viable alternatives. I'm talking here specifically about civic education. Parliament has a duty to ensure that its citizens understand the importance of their participation in strengthening the principles of sound public governance. With a civic education strategy, we can ensure more first-time voters, regardless of the system we choose of voting, and that many more will become voters for a lifetime, continuing to support the ongoing foundation of democratic governance, starting with a strategy that targets grade schools and high schools. I believe that Elections Canada should be institutionally positioned to play a leadership role in this strategy. In other countries, such as Australia, electoral commissions or agencies have the responsibility to not only administer elections, but to objectively inform citizens of their civic duty by providing accessible tools and resources. Thus, I believe that this committee should consider recommending expansion of this mandate for Elections Canada to provide foundational and objective education and awareness programs to young Canadians, to marginalized Canadians, and to new Canadians. Now I come to the voting system. First past the post. Some feel that this element of our electoral process would be the single most important reason for the long-term trend of voter apathy identified by scholars and experts. A major feature in our democratic system is the election of majority governments, with examples of minority governments a more common feature in more recent times.
Excuse me, Ms. Flumian, how much time would you have left in your...
Could I take another 2 or 3 minutes?
Not really. Maybe another...
well then.
30 seconds, 45 seconds? I can stretch it to a minute.
Well, I'll get
there'll be time for questions.
in my questions then.
Perfect.
I can do that.
Thank you.
By all means.
Thank you so much for your cooperation. So we'll have time for 5 minutes in the first round for Q&A and per member, and 4 minutes in the second round. So because we're going to end at 12:15. So we'll start with Mr. Aldag.
You know, I really would like to hear what you were about to get into. And so I'll maybe start, if you could take the first minute of my time to conclude or move into, I thought you were about to talk into some of the first past the post. And
I was to talk about it, and I'm not going to come to a conclusion on it except to tell you that in the same poll I was talking about earlier, there is interest by Canadians in exploring other options. And when you see the results, you can have a look at what you think of their interest. It's a broader study on governance. So my final comments were going to be all about constitutional conventions that are also affected by our voting system, because our voting system is only one dimension of the way we manage our constitutional arrangements, and the implications that changes to the voting system or the implications that you should have in mind as you might be proposing changes to the voting system as well, in terms of how
maybe
those...
I'll leave that aspect then for somebody else,
Yes.
And I'll move into something. So with Professor Rose, one of the things you looked at, you were talking about trade-offs. I'd made a note, trade-offs not looked at or need to be looked at. And I'm finding that we've had excellent testimony so far, and all three of you have contributed to that again this morning. We're getting a lot of the benefits. We've heard proportional representation, can do certain things, and it's referenced that it can result in minority or coalition governments. But we're not talking about the trade-offs. And as I've been sitting and thinking today, it's like I do believe that sometimes majority governments can do great things. We've heard from Mr. Cullen that some of these minority governments have also done great things, but I reflect that majority Liberal governments have done great things, majority Conservative governments have done great things, but mostly Liberal governments have done great things. And so I'd like to know, if you have any thoughts on some of these, the trade-offs that we're seeing with perhaps minority governments, trade-offs in majority governments. I'd like to explore that a bit. And if we could start with you, Professor Rose, on that, and then if there's time, I'll share that with the others.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I would answer that question in a sort of different way, and that is that when we talk about trade-offs, we're in Parliament, we're talking about what kind of Parliament do we want. Electoral systems produce also a Parliament, and a Parliament looks like a certain way based on the electoral system. If you imagine the electoral system as the engine, depending on how you tune that engine or what kind of engine, you're going to get different results. So it's really about the principles that guide you in thinking about that. So effectiveness is a great concept. But when we talk about effectiveness, we can talk about effectiveness being a large majority government. One would not disagree that a large majority government is very effective in getting through legislation. But it sacrifices the effectiveness of Parliament, which is, after all, a talking place, and the ability of members of all sides to engage in discussion and deliberate. When we talk about effective parties, we can talk about large brokerage parties that command wide swaths of ideology, as they do in Canada. Or we can talk about effective parties as being small, regional or specific-based parties. So the trade-offs are really around the kind of parliament you want and the kind of government you want.
Okay, and with that, you know, as I look in Canada where we have this clear division of powers, and you know, so the provinces have their responsibilities, the federal government has others. When we move into perhaps, if we moved into a system of more minority or coalition governments, are we going to be sacrificing anything in being able to deal with the national issues, strong national leadership, and the things that fall under federal jurisdiction if we move away from the kind of majority systems that we've had?
Well, I think really it's about how we think about our party system. Our party system is a brokerage party system, which is a big tent. Arguably, you know, one of the few countries that has such a broad group of people under one political party. If you think of it that way, political parties are coalitions now. What you're doing is creating coalitions after the election rather than before election. We have coalitions now, except that they're created before the election within a party. And the brokering of interest within that party occurs now. The brokering of interest between parties would occur after the election. It's the same thing.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, we're good. Mr. Reid. I mean,
I think he's good too. In his sense. I wanted to thank all the panelists for being here, and I wanted to start, if I could. In fact, this may take up all the time that I have in the first round. Asking Jonathan Rose a couple of questions. You are, of course, one of Canada's leading experts, one of Canada's 2 or 3 leading experts on citizens' assemblies, and you've spoken very favorably based on your experience. I'm just quoting you here. You say, a citizens' assembly where real learning, deliberation, and consultation takes place is actually a higher threshold for legitimacy than a referendum. So that, as someone who takes referendums very seriously, I'm impressed by that. And I wanted to ask this question. A year ago you said, I think it shouldn't be a blue ribbon panel deciding this, meaning electoral reform, or politicians. Whatever decision is reached, it should be put to a national referendum for approval. So is it still the case that you would regard the gold standard for changing the electoral system and ensuring it's legitimate to be a citizens' assembly followed by a referendum on the decision arrived at through the citizens' assembly?
Thanks for the question. I think the quote you're referring to is actually a part of a quote where I said before that some would argue that a referendum would be a good thing, and I think that there are great reasons to have a referendum, the primary one of which is legitimacy. But I still maintain that the gold standard, as you say, is a citizens' assembly, in part because, unlike a referendum, a citizens' assembly has an opportunity for the public to learn. They have an opportunity for the public to deliberate, and they have an opportunity for the public to engage in the issue in ways that don't occur in a referendum. I also would point out, I mean, after looking at and thinking about the referendum in the UK recently, it's given me pause, I must confess. That referendum was hijacked by dominant personalities. It was hijacked by mudslinging, improper characterization of issues, and more importantly, the participation was around 72%. So if you think of 52% of people voted to leave the EU, 52% of 72 is about 38%. I don't understand how that's a mandate. So on the legitimacy front, it seems to fail. I confess, I acknowledge that the idea of having the public have an input in a meaningful way is hugely significant. The question is how to achieve that.
That's an interesting way of looking at things. That suggests then that in the case of the referendum in Ontario, if the approval, I know they had a 60% approval, but let's assume it had been 52%. We had the same participation rate that we actually had, which was lower than 72%, I believe. Would that have meant that the majority vote in favor of the MMP system that you and the Citizens Assembly had worked on would have been illegitimate? Your own words indicate that you do believe it would have been an illegitimate mandate.
No, I think the way in which you think of a Citizens Assembly is similar to a jury. So what does a jury do? A jury looks at evidence, deliberates, comes to a decision, and then makes a recommendation to a judge. A judge doesn't second-guess a jury. A judge doesn't second-guess a jury because that task has been given to the Assembly to deliberate and weigh on the evidence that's before them.
Would your preferred model then be, I've got the quote from a Reddit where you said virtually the same thing. I used to think referendum was important. It is, after all, a way to ask for the public to support an elite-driven citizen or political initiative. But then again, we don't ask a judge to approve or comment on a jury's decisions, so maybe we need not ask the public to approve a Citizens Assembly's process. So may I take it then that your position is now that we should have a Citizens Assembly and its decision should effectively be binding upon the government without the need to go to a referendum?
I don't think you need an either-or, but I do think a Citizens Assembly or some kind of deep deliberative exercise would be useful. And I'm happy to sketch out, if we had time later, about how that might look. But absolutely, you're the elected representatives, and in some sense, the buck stops with you. But I recognize that. But I think there is an opportunity not to replace, but to supplement the work you're doing with citizens engaged in it in a meaningful way.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but I'll probably come back to the next round. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. Mr. Cullen.
It's really an honor to have you folks with us here today and your experience. To you, I'll start with Professor Rose, then I want to move over to Mr. Pilon, maybe second round with Ms. Flumian. You talked about deliberative versus consultative. We had suggested to the government, the NDP had early on, of a form of a Citizens Assembly to work in parallel with what we're doing here, but it seems like with the timeline, that was not accepted by the government. And it seems like the timeline we have now, it's hard for me to imagine. Maybe someone can make a suggestion of how we could incorporate more of a citizens' engagement than we have. But you talked about being deliberative versus just consultative. This committee is about to, in September, October, get out on the road, talk to people. To be deliberative with Canadians, would you recommend, or how would you recommend the committee present the question that we're asking of Canadians? What are we asking them to comment on? You said cart before the horse, don't put a bunch of systems up. Is it about asking them what priorities matter most? Direct geographic connection, more women in politics? Are those the types of questions and answers we should be receiving back from Canadians, is what they value most? Because that will then inform the system that we suggest.
Exactly.
Is that the process you would imagine?
I think that's exactly the process. Okay. But I mean, I think there is an opportunity for a Citizens Assembly to provide a broad-based, evidence-based opinion about what values are important and how that informs your work.
Even with the timeline and the commitments that we have to change the system prior to 2019. So perhaps one of the things, perhaps not today, but if with your expertise and the people you know, to be able to provide the committee with some recommendations on what that would potentially look like under the time constraints that we have, I think could be something we should consider, because the question of legitimacy is important to all of us. I wanted to, perhaps this was to, yes, this is to Mr. Pilon. It's very disheartening to all of us as elected people that people vote for parties and not for our brilliance. I'm sure my colleagues and I are all dispirited today from that comment. I'm going to read you a quote. It's a little lengthy, but I'd like your comment on it. This is from Hansard a number of years ago from one of the MPs. Does he care at all that Canada is now the only complex multi-party democracy in the developed world which still relies on a 15th century voting system designed for medieval England? Does he care at all that 60% of Canadians in the last election voted against his government's program, and yet government holds 100% of the political power? And finally, does he have the capacity for one moment to transcend partisanship and his government's defense of the status quo to suggest that, yes, perhaps this place, the voice of the people, the place where we speak, Parliament should consider an electoral system which allows the plurality and diversity of political views to be properly reflected in this, the People's House? Would you agree with the general sentiment of that statement?
Sounds like me talking.
Sounds like you talking.
That sounds like me talking.
Well,
someone's
got to tweet our friend Jason Kenney, because that's Jason Kenney talking. And it's a view I also support, just in the view that he held at that time, because there's a couple of notions in there. One is that when parties get in, they like the system that got them in. So there's this barrier we have to overcome to consider another system. And the second is just the basic unfairness to Canadians, to voters, of the system we currently have.
I tell my students, don't knock politicians. It's a hard job. It's a thankless job in many ways. Weekends and evenings are spent, talking to people and doing stuff. I mean, it's a hard work. But that doesn't mean that your vote is a reflection of all that hard work. In fact, it's just sort of an expected part of the job. Though it's fairly recent, you may not know, but it was really only in the 1970s that Parliament gave the funds to MPs to actually set up local offices and do the kind of work that we seem to think now is an historical legacy. There's all kinds of evidence, just really clear evidence, that you are not the center of the voters' universe. I mean, really, most
Chair,
of the voters.
I move to strike that testimony from the record. If I could.
Ultimately, voters are not ideological in the sense that they wave left and right banners, but they are able to locate parties in terms of the values that they hold. Which party is the abortion party? Which party is the party on law and order? And they make their choices on the basis of that. And that is the most important thing that we're talking about here.
Allow me this. Is it not sometimes a mix, though? And I'm not saying this to aggrandize politicians, but yet we all door knock, we all have constituencies and connection with voters, and I prefer a voting system in which a connection maintained.
Yeah. I'm not against having local representation, but your job is to try to work out the balance. And right now we have an overbalanced sense of the local, right? People use it to basically try to block every attempt at reform, or these overblown ideas of the importance of the local. When people are surveyed, we had Andre Blais here the other day, he has a great study where he says to people, hey, what influences your vote? Do you vote on the basis of a local member? And 40% of respondents said, yes, local is very important. But then he asked a follow-up question. He said, yes, but what if that local member is not a member of the party you support? Now only 4% are prepared to support that local member.
Okay, we'll have to move on. We'll have to move on, but we get the point.
Right.
Yo.
Poursuivre la discussion d'abord.
Well, let's continue the discussion. First of all, I'd like to welcome the witnesses. And thank you for your extremely interesting testimony here today. To continue the discussion, Mr. Pilon, in Quebec, indeed, studies have shown that political persons such as the MP from Hochelaga-Maisonneuve, Louise Arel, was making a difference, even after 30 years spent in Parliament, made a difference, won by a margin of 3 to 5%. So if it was 50-50 voters voting for the party, there would be an increase of 3 to 5% for Louise or for François Gendron. So that is to say that the person is only so important, but the function is extremely important. It's not so much the individual that voters are concerned with, it's the link with whomever will be the MP. In Quebec, this is a major issue. When we wanted to go from 125 seats to 75 for a mixed system in Quebec, for example, services rendered by the state for emergencies in local riding offices, and that happens less at the federal level, actually, because there's less of a gamut of issues dealt with. But it is an issue of perception at times. So what is the role of a political party in a democracy, do you think?
Question, whereas the lead-up was all about the role of the individual member, and I think that the results that you describe are perfectly in line with the research, that someone who's been in the job for a very, very long time has been able to build up a public profile. The studies of voter knowledge about individuals tend to flow from the Prime Minister to cabinet ministers in the press to people who've been in office for more than 25 or 30 years. So that is clearly an important part of it. But again, when we look at the average, and we have a high turnover, as you know, in our Parliament, right? We have a very high turnover of MPs. So the situations that you describe are not as common as we might see in the British, Parliament, where people sit for a very long time in that Parliament. So again, I think that the research suggests that the ability of a local member to do local work, and I'm not against having a local member who does local work, but let's not overvalue the role it plays in a voter's choice. The bump that someone gets, the research suggests, is maybe 3 or 4% above or below the swing towards the party. So the key thing is the swing towards the party.
En fait, ce qu'on peut voir, c'est
So what we can see, in fact, is an MP that poorly executes the local riding work goes beyond the value of the party that's being rejected. And that may be over a very short period of time. But let's clarify what I was saying. Voters, and I have a deep respect for voters' common sense and good judgment since I was elected, but citizens, we're also being told, understand very little of today, the debates that we're having here, and they're not very conservative. We're saying that political parties are partisan. So in that case, should experts be deciding what the voting system should be? And if not, we need to equip ourselves with tools and means to do so. Everyone's telling us about education campaigns, awareness campaigns. That's not going to take place over 8 weeks, nor over one parliamentary session, maybe not even over the course of a single mandate. I'd like to hear your comments on that, please.
To look at this from a point of view of public education. What do people need to know about voting systems? I often tell people that selling a voting system is like selling a car. Right? People need to know about the performance. They don't need to look under the hood. Okay? Very few people look under the hood when they buy a car. But we seem to have this idea that somehow voters need to be electoral officers who can explain the mechanics of a system. Certainly our media is obsessed about that. So I would say, yes, we do. The evidence from previous referendums suggests that if you go the referendum route, you will basically be setting up a situation for it to fail. Because the evidence that we have from previous referendums is voters will say, I don't understand what you're asking me. I'm not expert in this. I'm just going to say no because I haven't really a clue what's going on. That's what the results. People rejected the other voting system reforms. The research shows they didn't reject them because they didn't like the options, right? They rejected it because they said, I didn't even know a referendum was going on, and I don't really understand what the issues are. So I do think there is a role for expertise. I think that the combination of partisanship, which I don't have a problem with, frankly, because I think that in a democracy people are allowed to disagree, and that's a good thing, and parties play a crucial role in mobilizing the public around different issues. But as I say, the public uses parties as a proxy for their own intimate knowledge. Right? We can't expect them to be expert in all these things. They're busy. They've got lives. Right? What they do is they say, hey, I trust that party. They seem to be upset about this, so maybe I want some more answers. Okay. By contrast, if the parties are fine with the change, then the voters will be fine with the change too.
Okay. Ms. May, please.
Thank you. I wanted to start with Professor Rose, and I also want to start by thanking all three of you for being with us this morning. I note this panel now we will have heard from 20 witnesses by noon, and Madame Flumian is our first female witness since Mariam Monsef. This is nobody's fault. I was on the steering committee. I helped pick the witnesses. It is what it is, but we're looking at a field where apparently the experts are dominated by the Y chromosome. So, moving on. Professor Rose, what I wanted to ask is about citizens' assemblies, and I'm not taking a knock at citizens' assemblies. I think the one in British Columbia, the one in Ontario have been fantastic. But as a gold standard for public education, what I began to realize as people didn't understand what the members of the Citizens' Assembly had learned, I realized it was almost as though you have a group of randomly selected great Canadians who throw themselves into this and care deeply, as your articles suggested, meeting through the summer in closed rooms in beautiful hot parts of Ontario because they care about democracy. But I almost felt as if these wonderful citizens emerge and say, we have the answer, the rest of the public is saying, what was the question? So as a matter for public education, are there drawbacks to a citizens' assembly?
I think what you've done is you've put your finger on the fundamental tension between the relationship between the Assembly and the work they do afterwards. And I think we can learn a lot about what has been done 15, 15 years ago. And we can use technology and use media to ensure that there is a conversation that is happening at the same time as the Assembly is learning. There's all sorts of technological tools we can do to encourage citizens to learn along with the Assembly, and I don't think we did that well enough in Ontario. In British Columbia, of course, they had a reporter who was dedicated to covering the Assembly, and no surprise that British Columbians knew more about the Assembly than Ontarians. In Ontario, we had a very difficult time getting attention in the provincial press for a number of reasons. But there's a real tension because it is independent of government, so it doesn't get the kind of coverage that government does, but the work it's doing is significant to the work of government. So is there a tension? Yes. Is it remediable? I think it is. And I think the way it is to make sure that the process has a public educational component at the same time.
So I want to put this question to each of you, and I'll start with Professor Pilon. This committee has been struck with other parallel processes underway for public education. Each member of parliament across Canada has been asked to hold town halls. The minister and the parliamentary secretary have said they are planning a tour across the country to try to listen to people, particularly from marginalized groups and people who don't usually participate, with adequate media coverage. This should encourage public education, I would think, even perhaps as much as or more than a citizens' assembly, depending on how much news coverage a citizens' assembly gets. But my question is, can this committee, and what could this committee do to become a tool of legitimacy that could be a proxy for that either citizens' assembly or other method of engaging the Canadian public across the board? And we have only a minute and a half for all three of you to try to answer my questions, starting with Professor Pilon.
You already are a tool of legitimacy. You were elected, there were platforms, people broadly understood the different things that were being discussed. I think the time now is to act. There's a higher order principle at stake. It's lovely that you all want to chat and have a group hug with the public on this issue, despite the fact you don't do it on hardly any other issue, right? But the higher order principle here is democratic equality. Do you think every vote should count? Do you believe majority governments really should reflect a majority of Canadians? Those are basic, to my mind, democratic values, and that is the business you should be focusing on.
I might gently disagree with Professor Pilon and say that I think the public do need to be involved in a substantial way. What that looks like, I think, is your question, and that is not focused on systems, not focused on, as Professor Pilon mentioned, the engine, but rather the broad principles. And my fear is that as you tour and you hear from Canadians, you're going to be hearing from stakeholders and not average Canadians. And the challenge of this committee will be to ensure that average Canadians who don't have a vested interest are at those meetings.
You shouldn't do anything that delegitimizes your role as individual members of Parliament, and therefore you are a very legitimate tool for having these conversations with Canadians. And in whatever you do, I would be careful if some of the solutions that are being proposed actually add to fragmentation, that you not create a bigger problem by adding to more fragmentation. You have to get to questions of what are the basic issues here, and then deal with, because it is a governance ecosystem. Changing one thing may or may not have an effect on other things. And you need the broader perspective before you can hone in on some of the individual aspects. So, for example, we've heard some testimony, but I would say, from all the information I have, Canadians strongly support attachments to their local MPs and to their constituencies. I would hazard a guess, if we checked your files, which I once did in another life, we would find that you have more than 4% of Canadians in your constituency phoning you about problems that they expect you to help them address. I would bet that for a fact. Therefore, that's a better connection of the roles you play in that function. So, by all means...
Thank you. We'll have to go. We're way over time, but those are good points. Thank you. Ms. Romanetto.
Women should have equal time at the
the steering committee will examine this for sure.
I have to say this has been one of the most exciting panels we've had so far, and I want to thank you for your frank comments and excellent testimony today. Professor Rose, we heard a little bit about the guiding principles, but more focused on a voter-centric approach rather than looking at it from the eyes of parliamentarians. And I think as committee members, that's something that we need to be mindful of when we're talking to Canadians, when we're talking about what those guiding principles are, for instance, the effectiveness from whose perspective? From our perspective or from their perspective? The simplicity from our perspective or for their perspective? And so I think there's going to be conflicting responses in those regards depending on who the audience is, ours or theirs. I'd like to see if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think that's one part we haven't actually touched on. We have conflicting ideas, parliamentarians versus voters, and I'd like to get a little more understanding from your part on that, and then I have another question. So if you could elaborate, please.
So I think that, thank you for the question. I think that the guiding principles of the committee, and presumably the guiding principles that will help you in your cross-country tour, are very broad. And in some cases, as I mentioned, they're really about products of a system, and you can't have a discussion about those because they're a consequence. Okay. So in thinking about what citizens want, I'm trying to encourage you to think beyond those 5 principles that are given to the committee. Other studies have taken a more broader role of that. And things like simplicity, which is reflected in your accessibility principle, are important. And things like voter choice, which experts don't highly value, are important among citizens. There's a great study written by David Farrell and his colleagues asking experts around the world to relate what principles are important and to link them to systems. And they found that experts actually are not as good as the 2 assemblies in Canada at linking the principles to the systems. In other words, experts can tell you what are important in terms of the final system, but they're not clear in relating those to those foundational things. And I think if you want a system that does what you think it should do, then you need to have a good idea of what those fundamental values are.
Perfect, thank you. And my next question is actually, we have Madame Plumien, who's talked a little bit about the importance of civic education, and then we have Professor Pilon, who said that Canadians don't want to see what's under the hood. So it's a little bit conflicting, and we've heard from other testimony that we're not doing a good enough job in terms of educating Canadians about the importance of the civic process. So I'd like to, if you could elaborate a little bit more, why you feel that Canadians don't need to know more, because we've been hearing testimony of the
because they don't know anything anywhere, right? I mean, do you think that the Irish voters know the weighted inclusive Gregory method? Do you think they can explain how STV allocates its representation? No, they can't, right? Neither can our voters explain to you how 39% of the vote turned into 60% of the seats. Just go out in the street and ask them. They're not going to be able to tell you, and that's the simple system, right? We know they mistake majority governments for being, actual legislative majority governments for other majority governments. So, the public knowledge is low, and that's because they're busy. Your job is to, be the experts and call in the experts as you need them. So, but the important thing is that the Irish, as an example, know how to use their system. How do we know that? Ballot spoilage in Ireland is actually lower than in our system. So we could intuit that if they didn't understand the system, if it was too complicated, as the critics allege, then we would expect to see lots of spoiled ballots. But they don't. So they understand how the system works, and they understand what to use it for. And that is the important thing. You're wasting people's time if you go into all the details because they glaze over, they don't see that. You've got to connect with them on why does this issue matter? And that's the broader questions of how should a democracy function? I say majority rule, effective representation. Those are 2 pretty key values that I think any democratic theorist would get behind.
Okay. Go ahead. You have 45 seconds.
I don't get to rebut?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Ms.
Thank you. Well, then I would say that the measure is not what is the voting system, is what is the effectiveness of the governance model. And the question is too narrowly asked when you're asking about this system over that system, because it's not a dueling battle about experts. If this committee can agree to a solution, the country will probably support you. That's the way our parliamentary system of governance works. It's imperfect at the best of times, but that's the way it's intended to work. It legitimizes your role, and there's nothing more important than the sanctity of this House for all of us. If you're an elite, it's because we chose to make you an elite. We accept that model in our system. And it's a better use and a more legitimate use of the respective roles that we all play in a governance ecosystem that is much broader than just one aspect of how you cast that actual vote. It legitimizes all your role, the role of governance, the role of the importance of Parliament, the role of our democratic institutions, and it also understands, as Westminster models of governance have over the many years we've been around, of how you will help, and your daily work here is to help evolve that system for modern times.
Thank you.
So your question has to be broader about the effectiveness.
Thank you very much. Mr. Richards.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to reinforce something that Ms. Ramanatto had said there. I thought it was really important. You know, she was in the very beginning of her question, and I'm just summarizing what she said. But certainly the point was made very clearly that you know, this needs to be about the interests of Canadians and the voters and the people when this decision is being made, and not about the interest of politicians. And so I just wanted to congratulate her for that very important point, because I think it is an important one, and that's the very reason why I believe it's so important that we have a referendum prior to any changes being made. Ms. Flumian, I guess I've got a couple of questions for you. You had written an article for iPolitics, I believe, or had made some comments in iPolitics, where you had talked about the Broadband Institute survey and indicating that there was, you know, 5 of the 5 identified goals for a voting system, and they were obviously those 5 goals were simplicity, strong and stable governments, allowing voters to directly elect an MP who represent their communities, ensuring that government has MPs from every region, and then a system that ensures a party's number of seats matches its level of support. And you had indicated in your comments that it seems that only the existing single-member plurality system satisfies 4 of the 5 criteria, 1 through 4, that you shouldn't make reform impossible, but won't make it easy either, especially with the tight timelines that will have to be met if everything is to be up and running at Elections Canada in time for 2019. So based on that, it brings a couple of questions to mind for me. So the first one would be, if you could maybe elaborate a bit more for the committee why the other models wouldn't and don't live up to those 5 standards.
I think there's hardly enough time here, and I could always provide you an answer in writing for your deliberations. Sure. But I would say,
try to be as brief. I guess try to do.
I guess I don't. I would come to the conclusion that there's enough pressure for some form of reform. It's your responsibility here to determine how much reform the system requires and how much it can tolerate over what period of time. And I think that if I had to rest my case on any of those things as being the most important today for the deliberations of the discussion today, it's maintaining that thing that is really important to Canadians, which I argue is the connection between constituency, which isn't to say that we shouldn't be experimenting or looking at experimenting at some form of proportional representation on top of that, but I do think that's a very important connection.
Okay, no, and I certainly appreciate that, and I would certainly share that is a very important point as well. Let me just, I might just come back to this a little bit more if we have a bit of time at the end, but I wanted to ask you a second question that came to mind from your comments there as well, which is talking about that, you know, the timelines necessary, and I'm wondering if you think that you know, a fixed hard deadline is unreasonable, and if we want to be able to do electoral reform properly, in other words, you know, because we have a very tight timeline, do you think that makes this process difficult and would make it unreasonable?
I think reasonable men and women can come to reasonable conclusions. So I think the first test of that will be how as a committee you work together, and what you will present as a series of a report, hopefully not a series of reports, a report to the rest of the Parliament of Canada, to the government, and they're only a proxy for the people of Canada. So I think that's the first test. How much unanimity or how much consideration will you give? What's the balance of your consideration? And what are you going to propose as a group? Because as I said, the purpose of this is to put you, I think, in the driver's seat, legitimize the role of parliamentarians who are our representatives in this holy house, and to have you work in the fashion that our system currently requires you to work, which is to mediate those differences, to try to come as much as possible in fashioning solutions that represent all Canadians' interests in this matter.
35 seconds, okay. I wanted to try and return to that first question I had, but I don't think we have much time, so maybe I'll thank you there, and we can come back. I think I'll get a second round, so we can maybe come back to it then.
Come back early enough?
Thank you, Mr. Richards. I appreciate the cooperation. Mr. De Courcy.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci à nous.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our three witnesses for being willing to join us this morning.
I appreciated you channeling Dr. Seuss to kind of tell us where we should be thinking in crafting perhaps a new system or electoral change for Canada, thinking about who we are, where we are, and where we want to go. And I would submit that perhaps that's a potential title for our report when the time comes. I also appreciated the focus on values, principles, and that those should guide the discussions that we have with Canadians. Inevitably, there will be tensions there. Ms. Flumian, you also kind of highlighted another tension, which is, are we valuing a conversation on the way we experience voting, or what type of parliament do we want reflected back toward Canadians? I'd like to ask you both to expand a little bit on those conversations.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Yes, thank you. I think that in the discussions around electoral reform, there are many issues that are being conflated. And if I leave you with any one idea, it is to try to disentangle these various threads. And the threads are, what do we want out of Parliament? What do we want Parliament to do? And then, relatedly, what is the role that citizens should play? I think in an exercise that involves a fundamental thing, arguably a constitutional thing, as a voting system, citizens do need to be involved. I think we can have a reasonable discussion about what that involvement looks like, but I think they do need to be involved. And if they are involved, I think it needs to be based on education. I'm not suggesting that citizens learn the mechanics of electoral systems, but my experience has demonstrated and showed me time after time that citizens, if asked, will rise to the task. And we don't ask them enough. And I think all citizens have opinions and ideas about what's important in elected representatives. And to me, that's the goal of this committee, to tap into that and to relate it to the work they do. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll touch briefly on this, and you can see it in my written submission after this presentation. I would, yes, think that citizens make the greatest connection of what all of this means to them in outcomes, in terms of outcomes. What is our parliamentary form of democracy based on democratic principles that we hold dear in this country meant to do? That's their litmus test for what this works. How well do we work together? What compromises do we come to? The mechanisms and modalities are important only insofar as they help us to achieve those outcomes. And that's where I think you've got to step back a bit from the very particular questions and ask about those outcomes. If you ask about those outcomes, I would also ask the committee if you would look at a few other things. If we change the way we elect parliamentarians, and therefore the balances that you're trying to create within that system, also give some thought to the implication that that has, because Parliament in of itself, without the functioning of government, does not end up in outcomes, right? It's the combination of the two. We have some parliamentary conventions you should look at. What does loss of confidence mean in a House that functions in a very different fashion? Well, explore that, because that may give you insights in the reverse order as to what you're trying to achieve. Explore the issues of what dissolution means in a world where loss of confidence may be explored in a very different fashion, right? What does it mean? We know that historically in our current system, which doesn't mean we shouldn't change it, loss of confidence leads to dissolution. Is that what's going to happen in a world where we may put other mechanisms in place? Because that is an important part of our governance fabric that leads or doesn't lead to outcomes being achieved by the way we manage things. So we have a few of those conventions in place that we should be paying some attention to. If we make those changes, then let's not repeat some of our past behaviors. If we go to make those changes, how do we put those things out in terms of conventions and how they're to behave in a most transparent fashion? Does an incumbent Prime Minister publish for the House and for all Canadians an understanding of what those things mean, so that a Governor-General is instructed as to what the presumed wisdom is? Parliament knows how to behave, the various constituent components of Cabinet. What happens if we propose a system that leads, and I could live with any of these systems, right? God bless democracy. What happens if we have a system where we have multi-party members of cabinet? The issues of cabinet solidarity have been fundamental to the way we function. How would we explore those? I'm not saying we shouldn't.
These are interesting, definitely interesting questions, but we'll go now to Ms. Benson. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Benson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Pylon and Mr. Rose, and I'm just going to sort of give you a bit of a scenario. My background is in the nonprofit sector. I've worked in the community and spent a lot of time on committees and consultations. And actually, just last week, I was part of a roundtable in Saskatoon around changing a government program. And often, what happens when we come to those tables where we're trying to have our some information go up into some place in order to help a group make a decision, it's really unclear as to what impact what we're saying is going to have. And what that group of people asked was, what was the question you were asking us to answer? What has happened before? So you almost go back, they want to jump right in, we go back. What has happened before? And what isn't working now that we want to change? And so I'm interested in both of your comments about, as we head into going out to the public, and I do believe there's a huge role for parliamentarians to play a leadership role. But how are we going to hear from people in order to roll up that information into some kind of coherent data that can inform a decision? And the other thing I want to say is, I think there's a technical exercise here that we can use experts for, but what I want to know is, how do we, in the process we have now, get citizens' input into this so that they feel they've had a say, knowing that the system we think right now isn't working. So, just comments.
It's very challenging, and I want to make clear. I mean, there's a little bit of democracy exercises I think have been excellent, and they've shown that the public, given a chance to become informed, can make very, very good decisions. So I'm not against that idea. But that is not the situation we face now. And if you go out and ask people what they think, they're going to tell you stuff they already know, which privileges the status quo. You are privileging the status quo in your process, if that's what you do. Because what do people know? They know what they've experienced. They don't know, they haven't any experience of other methods of doing things. So that's why I say, I hear from this committee an overvaluing of how much you're going to get out of the public. In terms of the feedback that they might give you, because they don't know anything about our institutions. And again, I don't say that as a criticism. I think people are busy and they look to you to lead. They do have a sense of which side they're on, what kind of politics they want to see. And that is what determines these decisions more than any of the things you're talking about. Let me give you one quick example. Vancouver uses an at-large voting system for its city elections, adopted in the 1930s. There have been 6 referendums whether or not to get rid of that system. They've all failed. So the public that you claim is so focused on the local, is so obsessed about having a local member, has in fact chosen to keep an at-large system. And it is divided strictly on partisan lines, right? Supporters of the right-wing party have said, hey, this at-large system works for us, let's keep it. And the left-wingers have said, it's really bad, let's have the ward system. And because the right-wing voters are more likely to come out and vote, they win, and the less privileged voters, who are less likely to come out and vote, lose.
Mr. Rose?
So it is a challenging question, and I appreciate where you're coming from and how that informs what interests you. And I think you said it nicely when you said, what do we want in an electoral system? And to me, that's something that every Canadian has an opinion about. And I agree with you that there's also a technical exercise that comes later. But for me, the role of the public at this stage and when you go out is to assess what Canadians want in a system. I mean, we have good ideas from public opinion surveys and other forms, but we haven't heard directly from Canadians on that issue. Why I think the exercises you've talked about have not been successful is because they're merely consultation. When I say merely, I mean they are about letting people vent what they already know. But what's important to precede that is deliberation, which is education, so that people can assess what they think they know and change their opinions in light of what they've learned.
My next sort of comment is about, both of you, Mr. Pyle and Mr. Rose, have sort of commented on about sort of what we need to talk to Canadians about. Like, where do they come into the conversation? And you've both talked about, you know, I don't know how my car works, but I drive it and bought one and all that kind of thing. So could you say a bit more about sort of how we can frame the conversations, and hopefully they are more deliberative than consultative?
Perhaps this could enter into another answer to it.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, because we were up, our time's up.
Sorry.
We'll go to Mr. Deltel now.
Monsieur le Président. Alors,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your federal parliament. My 6-year reflex, I said provincial first. Ms. Flumian, first of all, I'd like to direct a question to you. I've been listening to your comments and I've found your statements very interesting, but what I seem to understand you're saying is that you place a great deal of value on the work we do here, and we thank you for that, but at the end of the day, we are not the ones who make the decisions on this. In this room, we had the minister who is responsible for electoral reform, and we asked her, is your government going to be bound to the recommendation that this committee makes? As you know, we're going to be traveling across Canada. We're hearing experts and citizens like you. We asked the minister, this is very serious work that's being done here. All political parties are involved that are in the House of Commons, and we will have recommendations. And she said, no, I'm not bound by your recommendations. So what exactly does that mean? It means that at the end of the day, only one person is going to make the decision, and that's the Prime Minister, because he controls the executive, which is cabinet, and also controls the majority of members in the House of Commons. So it's not all Canadians who are going to be making any kind of decision on what a new electoral system will look like. It's going to be one person alone, the Prime Minister. What do you think of that?
Really important here, and I think the greater amount of hard work that will lead to discussions that may or may not result in unanimity that are in the public domain will condition the discussion and the conditions that are made going forward. And I think there's no escaping that. And the only way you can escape that is if you shirk your responsibilities and place the consultation and the duty for what are the crucial questions on this issue elsewhere. And I think that's how you legitimize the role of parliamentarians, the role of Parliament. This is how you link the role of Parliament to the role of government. And I think part of the bargain that's actually broken here, which is why we're having these conversations, is that historically parties have run on their party platforms, convincing their base and convincing a large enough number of Canadians to form government. Once they pivoted into government, because pivot's the word of the day these days, right? They then understood that they were here to represent all Canadians. They stayed in government so long as they understood that. When the moment they forgot that, out they went, okay? Now we've gone through a period of time where Canadians expressed great dissatisfaction at the way we were governed. That's the fundamental question here. What are you going to do to affect that? And I think you've got the primary role to play on this issue in having that conversation with the minister and in having that conversation with her colleagues in cabinet, who are your colleagues in Parliament. And the function is supposed to be that Parliament is supreme in our system.
Mais ultimement, j'apprécie beaucoup le fait que vous l'avez.
I certainly appreciate the fact that you value our work, and we will be meeting many Canadians. But at the end of the day, since the minister said she wasn't at all bound by the committee's recommendations, it'll be a decision made by one person, the Prime Minister. In your view, what's the best way of ensuring a broader legitimacy for this exercise, other than a referendum?
I'm glad someone asked me about a referendum. The best way to ensure legitimacy is for you to hone in on recommendations that will demonstrate how the narrow focus of your question improves the broader governance question. Put that to the Canadians you will consulting with and discussing these matters with. Make that open and transparent, which of course by virtue of these committee meetings it is, and that will draw everybody in the country to conclusions about where this should be heading. And if it takes more than one round of these committee meetings over the course of a life of any parliament, so be it. That is the hard work of governing. So, on the issue of referenda, if I have a moment, or will I pick it up in another question?
No, you have about 45 seconds, so go ahead.
Well, I don't know if I have 45 seconds, but here I go. It's a very blunt instrument, that leads to binary choices on very complicated matters when we haven't even figured out what the questions are yet in a governance ecosystem. So when I look around the room, I look at the age of this committee and I look at my own age, and I will say that I am the generation, as you are the generation, of people who are the recipients of national referenda and referenda recovery in a world where our national referenda have tended to be extremely divisive, not leading to goodwill and greater understanding on the importance of the issue. And this is why it's so important that all of you as parliamentarians take this role seriously in what you're going to be doing. So there's nothing more important, because I have to say that for our whole governance ecosystem, as a former public servant, that's how I spent 30 years of my life, we have spent an entire time reflecting on the outcome of those referenda. But here's the good news. We have evolved our models of government. Today, 1981, when I started working as the Department of Finance, it was a very different model of government than it is today, when we have made it a far more decentralized system in every aspect of what we do.
Thank you so much.
And that's been your job. Thank you for it.
Thank you. Ms. Sahota.
I'm so delighted to have all of you here today. It's been a very enlightening panel, and you guys have been very diverse in your views and, of course, physically as well, which is nice to see. There's been, we've been hearing a lot about what do voters really know. They don't know the system is what I'm hearing. But, Mr. Rose, you were saying what they do know is what they value. And from your Ontario Citizens Assemblies, you said simplicity was one of the things that they highly valued. And Ms. Fluman, you've said that the most important value is the connection between parliamentarian and his constituency, or his or her constituency. And we were talking a little bit about perspective. Is it our perspective? Is the voters' perspective on what system we need to move forward with? What I do know, and what this committee knows, is we need to make progress. And you had stated something a little earlier, Mr. Pilon, that we haven't always had constituency offices. This is a new phenomenon, and now all of a sudden we're so caught up on that being important. Well, let me tell you that I do the door knocking. I do talk to constituents that walk into my office, and I think that is the part of the progress we've made in Canada. That is how we've progressed, and I think it's been for the better, not for the worse. So my question to you is that connection between constituents. I have constituents that don't just come from that Canadian perspective. They've immigrated from all over the world, so they come from different systems and different perspectives, and the one thing they unanimously pretty much tell me is they love Canada because they cannot connect with their member of parliament in any other country the way they can here. And so not just for me, I value that connection with them, but for them, that's what I hear day after day. At the door in the election, I heard, well, you're here now. What makes us think you'll be here later? That connection that, is so important to them, and the availability that you have for them. So whatever progress we make, would you say that that's something that we cannot risk losing at this point now that we've made that progress?
Anything that connects voters to the political system in a cohesive way is a good thing, and I support it. And I realize I'm fighting an uphill battle, perhaps with my audience, in attempting to suggest that we just temper your enthusiasm for your local representative role. Perhaps I've overstated the case, only because, of course, I think it's overstated generally in the other direction. But in no way am I trying to suggest that I want a system where there is no connection. There should be a connection. And in fact, I don't agree with my colleague's comment that PR would represent a trade-off on the local representation front. As you heard from our Irish experts, the Irish have very, very strong opinions about the connection that they should have, and local members who do not do their service are rapidly punished by their electorate. But the beauty of the Irish system is that voters can punish a local representative who is slacking off and not doing the local job without sacrificing the support that they want to give to their party. And that is a very sophisticated way to balance out these different interests. And that's what I'm asking you to consider as you move forward, is that we can have our cake and eat it too on the local representation and effective representation for parties. Because I really do think that the parties are so crucial. When we take away parties, what happens? Local representation, voter turnout plummets. Because without parties, voters find it very difficult to participate. What happens when you leave your party and you run as an independent? You lose. because that party label is a crucial part of the way that people participate in politics. So please, do not misunderstand me. I am in no way discrediting the hard work you're doing on the doorstep or the appreciation that that small group of people who come to see you feel. That is really meaningful to them, absolutely. And I say we can have that. And the claims that we hear about PR systems that they will somehow wreck that are false and unsubstantiated.
Well, I began by saying that the key word in this discussion was contingency. And I would say that in response to your question, local representation is important. And as was just described, the Irish case is a great example of local representation. But because the constituencies, the geographic constituencies, are reasonably small, they sacrifice proportionality. Most experts would suggest that in order to have true proportionality, you need about 5 representatives per district. If you have less than that, you give up some proportionality. So in Ireland, they clearly say, we like the fact that there's local representation, and we're willing to give up some of the proportionality. That's what I was referring to when I meant trade-offs. When the Ontario Citizens Assembly members mocked up a STV model for Ontario, they realized quickly that if they wanted proportionality, which is something they desired, either the ridings would have to be enormous or the legislature would have to be increased significantly. And those trade-offs were the things that they played with. I'm not suggesting that's the domain of this conversation. I said to myself I didn't want to get into the mechanics here today, but in answer to your question,
thank you.
That's the way it's
We'll start the second round with Mr. Alda.
I wanted to go back to Ms. Flumian just to see, you were talking about electoral, referenda. Had you finished your thought on that? I just wanted to make sure you had time to...
I think you got the gist of my
message.
message.
I did, but just in case there was anything
I could go on, but it's wasting time,
okay,
so
perfect.
please.
Something I'd like to put to all three of you. We've seen attempts at electoral reform at the provincial level. We've talked about that. We've heard that citizen engagement was done in great ways in Ontario and BC, and yet it failed. And so as we embark on this one, I'm hearing you've given us some thoughts, but could each of you, share with us your thoughts on what we need to do differently to come to a different result in the end than what we saw has happened in the provinces? And maybe Ms. Flumian, if you want to start on this one.
Thank you. Be a pleasure to. Whatever recommendations your deliberations take you to, this is my fundamental message of what I've been trying to say. Rest them in our entire governance ecosystem. People want some change. People want evolution. Our system has to evolve in order to maintain that primordial connection directly with citizens, which I think is fundamental to our democratic system of governance. But understand the whole system. In Ontario, when the work of the Constituent Assembly was done, the government essentially took a pass. That may have had an impact on the result of that reform. So let's look, that's why I'm saying look at the entire ecosystem and understand the role of all these folks, because you are challenging the status quo at all levels. You're not just challenging your relationship or whose perception of, is it the citizen perception or parliamentary perception? Quite frankly, those should kind of overlap as often as possible, right? So look at the entire system in which you're going to nest your recommendations, but there is no magic bullet. The answer is not first past the post or proportional representation or some combination, because fundamental to all of this is reforming and evolving your roles as well, right? Whatever system we have, you're getting elected by some mechanism to help govern Canada, right? So in today's day and age, the more connection you have, whether it's through constituent assemblies, whether it's through other mechanisms, the value of a constituent assembly is highly deliberative. The problem with the constituent assembly is deliberative for the people who are in the room. The rest of us think they've drunk the Kool-Aid. I didn't go through the same process. I don't understand it, right? I put much more value on your deliberative discussions, because that's what you're here to do every day, than I put on the value of others externally to it, especially when I'm a public administration expert myself, right, and a governance expert myself. So the answer is connect as much as possible, but connect on the questions that are going to matter, and nest your questions that you're going to be asking Canadians in the aspects of the system of which voting is only one dimension. Only one dimension, because voting, as I said earlier, the reason why there's a malaise in the country is because there was a strong view that there was a big disconnection between those who governed us and the way we're governed and what we tried to say to those who are governing us. And that is Parliament, it's the government, and it's definitely, Parliament is not composed of some amorphous, it's all of you individually and the roles you play. So the importance of a not-for-profit sector, where does it find its voice? Does it find its voice through? Like, those things are fundamental questions to what these questions about how we exercise the vote are supposed to address. So nest your recommendations, your deliberations within that broader governance ecosystem. You change one, you'll change another. So for example, I was a public administrator for 30 years. If we change minority government models, which I'm not arguing we shouldn't, okay? If the cabinet is composed of multiple types of parties, it changes the role of the public service. Good on us. Let's explore what that means. Let's not get into unintended consequences that are bigger than what we're trying to correct by not understanding the implications of what this aspect of your questions and the implications they have on the broader democratic governance system. Thank you.
Half a minute.
Okay. Do either of the others want to?
I mean, again, I think what you're going to see in your consultations is, partisan types and, advocacy groups, and they're going to reflect back some of the opinions that are already here in this room. So in that sense, it's a bit of an echo chamber. But some stragglers might come in who aren't committed. And for them, I think you really have to get at what's at stake. Okay, you like local representation, great. But, there are these other things, and you have to recognize that if you have this, how will it affect the other things that you also say you want? Yes. It can't just be a freebie.
Understood. Now, Mr. Reid, please.
And it's 4 minutes rounds now, is that correct?
4 minute rounds, yeah.
Okay. I wanted to go back to Jonathan Rose, but not with the question I was going to ask earlier. You said something that made me want to inquire further. You discussed the Irish model, and I don't know if you heard the testimony from the two professors from Trinity University who appeared earlier, but they noted, and this connects to your observation about proportionality in STV, they noted that in that country, the fact that the government gets to control the law as to how their system is designed from one election to the next has resulted in the size of districts being decreased, the number of members. So there's a 3-person minimum, and the country's been drifting closer and closer to 3, regardless of whether it's Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael in power, because both of those two parties have a communal interest in restricting proportionality. They are both likely in a 3-person electorate to get one MP, whereas they can freeze at some of the smaller parties. So I merely observe this. I guess I'm asking this because you've also raised the problem of the size of ridings. With this particular model, is there a fundamental problem in Canada that your ridings have become too large in terms of geography, or they become too small in terms of members to be significantly proportional?
Well, again, yes, I think those are the trade-offs. I mean, if you look at the Australian system, where there is better proportionality in the STV model,
this is the Australian upper house.
Yeah, the Senate. The number of people per district is much larger. So you can achieve proportionality if you have at least 5. And if you try to think about having at least 5 or greater representatives per district, and you look at the country and you try to maintain the principle of representation by population, something has to give. And what has to give is either the size of the district or what you're willing to give up in proportionality.
Right. I mean, in Australia, I know it's 12 senators per state, but it's 6 per election typically, right, unless you have a double dissolution. So really, 6 achieves that goal at the cost of having, in the case of Western Australia, a single electorate or riding that is the size of Ontario and Quebec combined.
That's right, Kalgoorlie. Yeah, the riding of Kalgoorlie, yeah.
Well, that's the lower house, but for the state of Western Australia, it's a single district for the purpose of Senate elections. You're right, Kalgoorlie is about 80% of that. I've seen the riding map. Anyway, so those are the trade-offs. Does the model that came out of the Citizen Assembly you were involved in was a different model? It was the MMP model. In your opinion, does that achieve a better result? I think in your case, you actually advocated adding some seats as well. Is that correct?
That's
right.
Minute, 1 minute, please.
Yeah. With the MMP, there are a number of different design variations. The big ones are the ratio between local representatives and the tier, and the Assembly members thought 70-30 was about right. 25% on the tier is about what you need. And they wanted to return the legislature to pre-Mike Harris days, so it did increase it from 103 to 129. But there are a number of other design decisions that the Assembly members raised that affect both proportionality and the values they wanted, open and closed list, the ballot structure of whether you have in Germany, in Saxony, an opportunity to rank your candidates on the local district, whether you want to have a threshold and what the threshold would be, because while the Assembly members recognize that more parties might be better, they didn't want smaller obstreperous parties, shall we say. So they raised the floor at 5%.
Merci.
So,
Merci beaucoup. On poursuit avec Monsieur Cullen.
Two questions coming off Twitter from Leah Westlake. One is, and I'll put this, I think, to you, Mr. Pilon, mixed member proportional systems maintain local representatives, local representation. Just to clarify for her.
Yes. Yes.
The second one she asked was, could we try proportional voting for a couple of elections and have a referendum? That way the public would know.
Well, I guess there's some people who have floated that idea. I think my views have come through fairly clearly. I don't accept the current system meets the democratic standard of the 21st century. It's a pre-democratic holdover, and it's been kept in place because it served the partisan interests of the parties who could change it. And it's time to change it. That's my view. So I would say putting something like voting rights, the equality of our voting rights to a referendum is fundamentally unsound in democratic terms. We don't do that. And I don't think it's, Switzerland had a vote on women's franchise. They didn't get the vote till 1972, right? We didn't do that because we believe that women should have the vote as a matter of principle.
That's a profound example.
We still only have 1 out of 22.
Yes. A question, you mentioned earlier about privileging the status quo in a referendum, that there's a certain momentum behind maintaining what we have naturally in the voters, particularly if the issue or the question is complex. It seems to me it's almost, the analogy I'm thinking of is if this were a race, a 100-meter dash, Olympics are coming, and the status quo was going off against a reform, the status quo starts at the 50-meter mark. And everyone says it's a fair... Ms. Flumien, do you get a similar impression just in terms of how referendum are then conducted when questions put?
Probably true.
Okay, Mr. Pilon?
I mean, we want the result to reflect the reasoned opinions, the informed opinions. I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that a legitimate outcome would be one where we were confident the voters had the information and the capacity to participate. I'm telling you, the evidence does not support that. Now, you can go forward, but it won't be an evidence-based decision, right? The evidence, I think, is quite clear. In Ontario, surveys that were done at the same time discovered that voters said a majority preferred a system that had a local member and proportionality in results. Those same voters turned out and voted down a model that would have given them that. That is a perverse result. And it's perverse because clearly the referendum process was not one that the public could engage with effectively.
Particularly if a government or parties engaged then work against the passing of the referendum, as was the case with the Liberals in Ontario.
And that was fairly clear, right? In all cases, PEI, Ontario, and British Columbia, the governments were fairly hostile to the process and put a host of barriers in the way to the system working.
We talked about the tension between local representation and people voting for parties, platforms, leaders. Under mixed systems, is the voter enabled with a choice? Say they want to fire their local MP, but still believe in the platform of the party that they happen to represent, or the reverse.
Exactly.
They like
so
the
both,
local MP.
both SDV and MMP, that are the two models that are chosen most broadly around the world as alternatives, both of them increase the power of the elector. One, to see that their vote counts. 95% of the votes actually contribute to the election of someone, unlike our system where only 50% do. And voters are not forced into an either-or, where I'm unhappy with party left, so I guess I'll vote for party right. Does
AV allow that to happen? Alternative vote, does it allow that to happen?
The alternative vote does not. Alternative vote has many of the same problems that first past the post has.
Okay. What am I doing for time, Chair?
You have about 35 seconds.
Just on conventions, because Ms. Flumien, you raised this. Hugo Cyr was in front of us just yesterday talking about shifting some of the conventions around governments shutting Parliament down, prorogation, dissolution, all of those things, and the power vested. Could we imagine reforming those as well, updating them, making them more democratic so that one party in power can't simply pull the fire alarm and get out of Dodge if they're threatened?
I think you have to because, and I think as part of what you're commenting on here in your general comments, would also be which ones in particular should be the subject of study immediately. And by the way, it would also go a long way, I think, if the government were encouraged to put them out publicly in plain language so that all parliamentarians who may not be constitutional experts in conventions would understand them, would understand the rationale for them, and the constraints they place,
Merci.
but also the possibilities that they offer.
Merci, c'est au tour maintenant. La parole est à Monsieur Thériault.
Thank you, Mr. Thériault. You have the floor. Well, I'd like to make a comment, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible so that I can hear more of your own comments. The Quebec experience has demonstrated that if citizens beyond experts and outside of political parties, that citizens are quite attached to the value of justice. They do understand the notion of justice. It's important to them, and they do understand the principle of equity and fairness. And that is what should direct the discussions. And territories, too. Now, we talk a great deal about governance and self-determination, but if you're talking about a parliamentary democracy, legislative power. In the Quebec experience, two phenomena came back continuously in the discussions, beyond the mechanics of elections. And that is a reproach towards the way politics is practiced and party lines. So, if in a democracy, legislative power is what really controls parliamentary democracy, it's clear that what irritates them is when they see a government MP, and I'm not pointing the finger at my colleagues across the way, when they see a government MP remain seated, whereas he or she should stand up and defend the electoral platform on which he was elected. We can surely agree that government represents the whole population, even if it was elected with 38% of the vote. But still, the electoral platform put forward by that party matters. So we speak very little about the fact that the system and all systems don't prevent anyone from voting for the representative they wish to have. Under the current system, the Green Party could form the government if enough people voted for the Green Party. We all understand that. The problem comes about after the fact. It's not at the time of election. It's when they determine what the executive is going to do. So I'd like to hear what you think of the executive branch and the legislative branch. We're going to have to change things at all levels.
Non, c'est un commentaire que je voudrais voir commenter.
It's a comment, and I'd like to hear your comments. You have 1.5 minutes, so...
I think there are a couple of elements that need to be highlighted in what you said. As I've said earlier, I think it's an ecosystem. Therefore, conventions, which are constitutional in our world and evolve over time, play an important role. People need to understand them. Legislation is important. The role of the three power orders of government is important. But behavior is as important. That's what's driving Canadians nuts, right? A party system that controls and is almost oppressive, it seems, from the outside looking in how people must vote, right, is part of what people are trying to fix. If we think that the answer to that question is the electoral voting mechanism, then by all means. But if you're asking me for how you might structure a conversation with Canadians and therefore a report, I go to here. I start with values. And you have to start with values because the values, then you can have a conversation that either they are or are not reflected in our given system that we currently have, which you have to deal somehow with the bias of incumbency, right, of the system we currently have. If you paint a picture of the fact that we should evolve, then your next question is going to be, do you evolve at warp speed or incrementally? Because I think everybody agrees that there's something about this ecosystem that's not working. But then to have a conversation with Canadians, I don't think it should be about the specific technicalities. It should be about what outcomes do you want. If we all come to the conclusion that we want to increase voter turnout, if we change a system in a way that confuses them overly much, well, it will drive down voter turnout and it'll create greater apathy in the system.
Thank you.
How do you combat that, right?
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Mena.
Thank you. And again, I thank all the panelists. We won't, as a committee, we won't be back together again for hearing witnesses till August 22nd. So I'd say that the three of you are taking us out with a bang of a really good discussion. And I wanted to go back to something that's in your paper, Professor Pilon. And this is, we're talking about constitutional conventions, and we're talking about the actual Constitution. And I'm grateful every day that I went to law school, and this helps me. But when I read the paragraph here about the British North America Act and the instruction we had from the mothership that we were to use the voting system from Westminster Parliamentary Democracy, and as I realized that it was conveyed to Parliament to change our voting system, and then you say that because the matters in sections 40 and 41 of the original BNA Act are superseded by other acts and are therefore spent. I mean, if you could just explain that. I mean, we no longer have it in our Constitution, but what you're saying, I understand, is that when we got the British North America Act, Great Britain told us, you are to have Parliament fix your voting system.
I don't think that, I think that's a misreading of sections 40 and 41. I don't think that one aspect is spent. I mean, the parts of sections 40 and 41 that detail specific things that have been superseded, of course, those aspects are spent. But the intention of it clearly says that electoral matters are in the hands of Parliament, and that still stands, in my view, constitutionally. Now, you have to understand, Great Britain imposed various voting systems on different countries. Ireland's a good example, right? They imposed SDV because they wanted to keep the different Irish groups apart. And of course, and then they would be weaker in resisting British rule. And you see that around the world, all those kinds of choices. Now, it just turned out that it worked for the Irish, and they liked it, so they kept it. So it was one of those things where it didn't work out. But in the Canadian context, they didn't. And probably the biggest influence on our voting system was the pre-Canadian voting systems that we'd already used in the United Province of Canada and the various colonies. So in that sense, the politicians were just carrying on with what they did before. Where people go wrong is they say things like, well, you know, our Constitution says that we should have a Constitution similar to Britain, so that means first past the post. But of course it doesn't, because while Britain used first past the post in 1867, they certainly weren't set on single-member ridings. There were multi-member ridings. They used the cumulative vote and the limited vote for different elections. They used SDV for university elections. All of this to the House of Commons. So if we're using the mothership as our influence, then there's plenty of examples of them experimenting with different voting systems.
Sense that Mary Antoinette Flumion wants to join in this discussion. I want to give you.
I would support that. Our model of governance has evolved from the model of responsible government that we kind of evolved to before the BNA Act, and have evolved that system continuously. So there's some provisions of the Constitution that speak to it. The rest is convention, and the rest is how we choose to legislate.
Right. So
and behaviors.
Yeah. So you, and Professor Rose, please feel free to jump in and disagree if you do. But it seems that your consensus of three panelists is that the instructions that we have constitutionally in the Constitution of Canada are that it's for Parliament to choose a voting system, and the one we were initially bequeathed is not cast in stone.
30 seconds, please.
So you're going to hear from constitutional experts later, so I'll in part defer to them, but we do have evidence about the answer to that question, and that's with the Senate reference case, of course. And there they said Section 44 of the Constitution, which allowed the government to, Parliament to make exclusive laws around the Senate and the House of Commons, was not sufficient enough to make a change because it altered two things: the fundamental nature and role of the Senate, and it affected the constitutional architecture. So I think to answer your question, we need to know about whatever hypothetical voting system would change those two things.
Thank you. Ms. Romanato.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to more of a pratico-pratique question further to my colleague, Mr. Cullen. Could you walk us through or suggest the best way we would be able to implement a new voting system, given the fact, Madame Flumion, you've mentioned that we are in an ecosystem. So if we change the voting system, there's also other elements. You said, you know, whether it be online, whether it be increasing voter turnout and so on. So if you could walk us through how would we even implement this, and from all of your perspective, but we'll start with you, Madame Flumion.
Hard to tell you what you're going to implement before you tell me what you're proposing to implement. But I think I've started, if I look at it at a conversation with Canadians that ends in implementation, I've given you some of the elements already. if one of the things we're trying to do is to draw more people into the active democratic governance and then use the drawing them in to make our democratic institutions more robust and more resilient as they're evolving, right?
Yeah.
Then you've got to come up with something about how you're going to position those trade-offs, then what a voting system has to do with it. Once you tell me what your preferred or even one or two options, because sometimes it's in playing out the options that you see what the wanted effects and the unappreciated effects are going to be. And I think that's a second conversation. We'd be happy to come back once you have that, but just to pick something out of the air for you, it'd be hard to do. And then, understanding that, you have to understand how quickly that could be turned into an administrative regime that could actually be implemented.
Professor Pilon?
We've had 10 successful voting system reforms in this country at the provincial level. We have a lot of experience introducing different voting systems, and we've had experimentation at the local level. My book looks at 18 countries across 150 years, every instance of voting system reform in Western industrialized countries. So we don't lack for models of implementation, and there definitely are some do's and don'ts. And the do's are that you have to recognize that there will be a bumpy road on implementation. There'll be a learning curve. And that means you got to swamp the polls with people who, as a former election administrator, I can tell you, you swamp the polls with people who can help people actually do the voting. That's where you run into the problems, right? As people adjust to a new system, they are going to need help to do that. And so as long as you've got the bodies on the ground, ramp up the budget for the first couple of elections in terms of people who are hired to do that, then you really will not have very serious problems, in my view.
And let's not forget we want to get them to the polls first.
Okay. Do I have a few more seconds? Okay. So based on what you've been talking to us a little bit today, I've started to kind of map out two sections, sort of outputs and mechanics from a citizen's perspective. So the values that you talked about, because we will be going on the road. We like to call it the road show. And when we're talking to Canadians about what we want to kind of come up with the framework of questions of what, and again, from a voter's perspective. So I've separated them out. As you said, outputs and the mechanics, thinking about choice, all of the things that are in our mandate letter in terms of the 5 principles. One area, and I want to get your opinion on it, should we be asking them about, how much do you currently know about the electoral system, and do you want to know more? And I'm just throwing this out there because I don't know if Canadians do want to look under the hood, because now you're making me wonder, do they really want to look under the hood, or are they just happy to have the status quo? So I'm throwing that out there.
The difficulty with that question is people don't know what they don't know, right? So sometimes, and so what you get is a very classed response, right? Middle class people often don't know anything more than poor working class people, but they have a stronger sense of entitlement. So they think that you should want to listen to their uninformed opinions. Poorer people and working class people tend to shy away from situations where their ignorance will be exposed. They self-select themselves out. And when we look at the voter turnout problem, that is a big part of the equation, right? It's not an undifferentiated group that aren't showing up. They are very classed in terms of their privilege. And so what they do is they say, I don't really know what's going on. I don't feel informed. I don't feel privileged. So they don't come. So that's going to be one of your challenges in terms of trying to gauge that.
Thanks.
I would recommend, very briefly, ask them some factual questions.
Okay.
That is where you will find out, because some of them will tell you, I know everything. But when you ask them some factual questions, you'll find out what they really know.
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Richards now.
Good, thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Blumien, I'll come back to you here again. But I think in relation to our previous conversation, you'd offered to maybe give a written response to why the other systems don't maybe match those 5 key or top 5 goals of the voting system.
Response the degree to which they might match, so that you can make the deliberation of where you want to go.
I guess what I'm asking for is if you could, because you would indicate they don't match, I would ask if you could provide why you feel they wouldn't match.
I would be happy to do so, and I'll do it for you in writing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Because I wanted to come to another topic with you as well. Another article that you had written for iPolitics, and I think you've kind of commented on a little bit in your comments today as well. You certainly talked about the idea that you believe that somehow referenda don't lend themselves to deciding complex decisions. And in the iPolitics article, you specifically wrote, and this is a quote, that the harder it is to reduce an issue to a single value judgment, the less apt a candidate is for a referendum. But I'm wondering if you would agree with me that an election, in fact, is a type of referendum. It's a referendum on who should govern the country. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I think, I don't think there's a relationship because of the nature of the complexity and the issues and the multi-parties and all of the issues that are associated with actually casting your franchise. So I'm not going to go there.
Okay, well, that's fine, because I would agree with that statement. I mean, elections are votes on, they're not a vote on a single question, they're a vote on multiple and complex questions, much like you were indicating that a referendum would be. So I guess what I wanted to sort of ask in relation to that, you know, I guess I find it hard, based on that logic, to see, you know, I guess the question would be, you know, if you're saying that the issues that are at play in an election are broad and they're multifaceted and they're complex, I would, and that's sort of the same argument that you're making about a referendum. I guess I'm trying to understand is if elections are valid, even though they're based on complex and multifaceted, complex issues, why are referenda not then valid, based on the same?
Well, I think I've made that clear, but I think the system works something like this, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Richards. We elect individuals who compose Parliament. We ask them the most complex questions for deliberation on our behalf. Your job is then to go out and to ask all those constituents, come back and check with all of your other colleagues in the party system that you belong to, and then in Parliament more broadly, and to then recommend to Canadians the best solution. That's the way our system works.
Yeah, and then I would say that the next step would then be to give Canadians the ultimate and final say on whether what we've come up with is something they would believe is valid and acceptable to them. And I certainly...
and in my judgment, you're a great proxy for that, as are the legislative and executive arms of government. And if should the three of you doing something wacko, the courts will be there to observe the views of Canadians too.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. That's your viewpoint, and I certainly have more faith in the voters than that. Now, I guess the other question I would ask, and
we have 30 seconds. Yeah.
Okay. Well, real quickly then, I guess I'll just ask to you, Ms. Flumian, because there isn't time for the others. But I guess do you not see there some kind of inherent conflict of interest in a process where politicians are deciding how politicians should be elected or re-elected?
Brief response, please.
Looks like Mr. Rose, you might have a comment on that as well.
Well, we don't have time, so we're already up to 4 minutes. So please, briefly, Ms.
I just saw Mr. Rose shaking his head yes, so I
know, but
I guess I would say it's a fundamental trust we place in our elected officials that they will rise above that and make the best call for all Canadians.
Thank you for that succinct.
On that, he indicated he wanted to make
10 seconds, Mr. Rose.
The line I use for that question is it's like turkeys voting for Thanksgiving. You're absolutely right. There's a huge conflict of interest, and that's why I don't think politicians should be making that decision. In a perfect world, citizens would be making that decision.
Got it. Okay, thanks. Mr. De Courcy.
Well, thanks, Ms. Flumian, for that eloquent lesson in how elections provide us with a representative democracy in which we deliberate and pronounce on complex decisions in a way in which I think all Canadians can understand the value of that system. And I note as well, reading your bio, that view is based in decades of diverse experience at some of the utmost levels of governance in the country. I want to get back to the idea of values, and Ken Cardy spoke to us on Monday about the values that citizens reflected, I believe, in the Assembly in BC, about fair representation, more preference in balloting, and the link between the elected and the electors, so that issue of local representation in political culture. We've talked about hoping that increasing voter turnout can help strengthen ideas around fair representation, and also I think it could strengthen the link between elected and elector. Dr. Pilon, you mentioned that inevitably PR will increase voter turnout. All the witness testimony that we've received so far has led us to believe that it is at best an ambiguous link, and that was the word.
I think what I said was that it would change voter turnout. And so, yes, you're right. The problems of voter turnout, no voting system is going to change that, because the key thing to increase voter turnout is to increase direct contact between the political class and the individual. We know that from studying voter turnout, that if you have someone who's not already committed to vote, the key predictor of them turning out to vote is some sort of personal contact. So, unless we're going to get, the old enumeration system was very good for putting people on the road and knocking on doors and alerting people that an election was coming. So what I said was that proportional systems, there's evidence that it will change voter turnout. So in New Zealand, for instance, they discovered that the composition of the electorate changed, even though the rate didn't. And so people who were only motivated by the ship is sinking, we could lose by 1 vote, they weren't as motivated under PR. But those who felt underrepresented, the less privileged voters, the ones who had traditionally been left out of our political system, and by extension their political system, they were more likely to turn out under PR. So as from a point of view of equity, and I think this committee is very interested in that, there is evidence that a PR system would move significantly towards addressing some of those equity concerns in terms of who is influencing what happens in our parliament.
So maybe, and thank you for the clarification, but we can consider the electoral system as one of a number of elements that could potentially help enhance voter turnout, thus strengthening the link between elected and elector within a larger ecosystem. And are we characterizing that properly? Maybe your view, Dr. Rose and Ms. Flumian?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think you said it really well, and that is the electoral system is only one component of a larger thing. And if you're looking for the electoral system to be a panacea for all your political woes, you ain't going to find it.
I agree.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I'm happy.
Yeah. Mr. DeCourcy. Ms. Benson.
Thank you. Just to sort of follow up on that point brought up, I guess all three of you to comment quickly, because I have another question. But, when you have an ecosystem, you can start somewhere. And I guess what I feel this last election is people have asked us to start somewhere, and that is on the electoral system. Would you, because you can sit around and talk about all the different pieces of the puzzle, and it just, then people throw up their arms and say, well, So, I guess I'm just throwing that out for a comment. You have to start somewhere, and is this a good place to start? How about that? A very simple question. Mr. Pilon,
I think you know my answer. Yes, yes, it's absolutely the place to start, because the place to start is to rebuild the trust with the electorate. And one of the ways we do that is by registering their preferences accurately. And so by registering their preferences accurately, you will rebuild that trust. People will feel heard. To me, a democratic process is a two-part thing. It starts with representation. Get people to the table. Let's not leave people out. Let's get everybody to the table. Let's hear the different views. Then we got to make decisions. Okay, well, then the majority rules. But as long as we have people, and there's lots of evidence to show that when people are missing from the table, so are their issues. So to me, it's crucial we start with the voting system, and we get better at bringing people into the room so that we can hear what they have to say. We won't necessarily do everything they want, but they will be heard, and they have a much greater chance of influencing the events if they're here.
Quickly, I agree that it's a great place to start, but it doesn't tell you where you want to go. And that, to me, is the more important question.
I have to agree fundamentally with that as well. It is an ecosystem. I'm not suggesting you throw up your arms because it's complicated, because we know what its component pieces are. Do we need some kind of change? Yes, Canadians are telling us we want change. I would start myself with the changes to the administration of how we manage voting now. I signal that strongly in my comments. Are we exploring every aspect around the E-dimension? Are we reaching out through educational components to marginalized groups? Are we making sure that we're doing as much as we can to squeeze all the juice out of that lemon? And then what you are going to recommend as further changes are going to be important. But I would be careful that when you recommend those changes, remind people that they're nested in a broader system, and that they're not a panacea for all the other things that have to change. The role of parliamentarians, the importance we place on the role of individual members who come to Parliament, the role of the executive and how respectful it is of Parliament, and all of those issues. That's all I would say.
My next question is, I'd just like to pose to three of you a question that came up when I was on election, and whether and that is that many people in my riding talked about the fact that all politicians just want to get reelected, and therefore the issues they deal with are four-year issues. And in my riding, people said, I want to talk about homelessness, I want you to work with other people, I want to get to a solution. So I would just ask you to reflect on the value of a different system, to have a different way of governing, that if we affected the voter system, that those kinds of issues could actually be addressed, and we'd actually get to solutions. So
we have about 10 seconds each, if you could be concise.
Frustration that people have, that parties get elected and then they don't do the things they promised. And part of that is the accountability issue, that people have difficulty making party right accountable to party left or vice versa. So I think a move to a proportional system would allow for a different kind of accountability to occur.
Mr. Rose?
I think what you're talking about is stability. And again, it depends on what you mean by stability. Policy lurches that occur in first-past-the-post system would not occur, or less likely to occur in PR systems. So if PR systems, if they're more centrist and they govern them for a longer period of time, are more likely to have that same kind of longer-term stability.
I would say the issue is about behaviors in addition to everything else we've talked about. No complex issue, whether it's homelessness or any of the others you can point out to, can be fixed by one minister, one ministry, one department, one anything. They're complex issues by their nature. It takes a collaborative approach to how we work together. That is the heart of how our parliament should work when it works at its best. That's why we have minority governments working in exceptional ways, because the premium is on behavior that requires us to work together.
Thank you.
So whatever voting system does that, fill your boots.
Merci. Monsieur Deltel, c'est à vous la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Deltel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's the heart of our democracy and one of the most important things that we have to decide. Because election, the way we elect people, is the heart of everything. All the rest belongs to the way that belongs to the choice that we make to elect our member. Budget, taxes, policies, international affairs, defense, everything belongs to those who have been elected. So it is the heart of our country. This is the heart of our democracy, and as far as I'm concerned, the way to elect people is the most important institution, more important than Gigi, than the Prime Minister, than anything else. Gigi, Governor General, you understand that. So this is why it's very touchy. And when we talk about institution, we must be sure of what we're doing when we make any move. So this is why we think that the best way to have, sorry for that, the best way to be sure that we are doing the right choice is to ask the people what they think of. And I'm not the only one who think of that. Let me quote famous minister, famous senior minister of the Liberal cabinet, the Honorable Stéphane Dion, former leader Liberal, academics for 20 years, well recognized from coast to coast, who said, and I will quote him, sorry I have some difficulty to read it, but les précédents rendent un référendum incontournable.
Referendum precedents are very clear in Canada. To change the electoral system, we need the support of the people. To change the way in which people vote, we need the opinion of the people.
Minister, Liberal minister, the backbone, the intellectual backbone of the government, who say that. I disagree with him on many issues, but I do respect the fact that he's an intellectual, an academic, recognized very well, PhD, and on that issue, can assure you that he's on the right place. Because in policy, in politics, in democracy, we are always on the right place when we ask people what they think of what is the best for the future. We all recognize, too, Mr. Speaker, that our system actual is not perfect. Absolument pas. Malheur à celui qui pense que notre système actuel.
Our system is absolutely not perfect, and it's unfortunate if anyone thinks it is. But no system is perfect, and that's why when we want to change something, we have to be absolutely certain of what we're doing. I would remind you that it took New Zealand 11 years to bring about their changes. Mr. Pilon, I fully understand that we don't share the same point of view on the referendum, and you are perfectly entitled to hold your views, and you're not the only one to hold them. And we're not the only people asking for a referendum by the same token, be it the Bloc Québécois or well-known federalists like Stéphane Dion, and we on the Conservative side believe that if we are to change our electoral institutions, the most important institutions in our democracy, that has to be done by asking the people what they think. Mr. Pilon, you don't agree. You believe that we shouldn't have a referendum. What authorizes you? Why are you entitled to know what's best for the people? 45 seconds.
that votes should count is what authorizes me to make the claim that I do. The fact is that votes should be equal. That is a fundamental democratic idea. We use the voting system we do not because it was authorized by the people. Elections precede the democratic era by many centuries. Our challenge is how do we change the original political institutions to embody the democratic values the Canadians have. And in 1867, we were not a democracy, right? Very few people could vote. It was open voting. There was violence at the polls. I mean, it was a very long process of attempting to impose some democratic values on our political system. And I have to say, you know, with all respect to Stéphane Dion, who's a brilliant man, he's wrong about the precedent. We've had 10 voting system reforms that were successful, that were passed by simple majorities of their legislatures. Almost no voting systems in Western countries have been introduced by referendum. This is a very recent phenomenon, and more to the point, the normative rationale behind the referendums was not any kind of belief or embrace that the people should be the authors of this. It was cynical political posturing by parties that were trying to avoid their commitments. And that is as true in New Zealand as it was in Italy, as it was in the 4 provinces that we had, or the 3 provinces that we had referendums here.
We'll go to Mr. Hoden now to end the round.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back on something that was just touched upon in the last questioning round about involving and engaging more young Canadians, marginalized Canadians, new Canadians. We heard some testimony yesterday that I thought was quite interesting about maybe perhaps lowering the voting age in order to get young Canadians at the age where they're probably more likely to come out at the polls because they live with their families or they're not in a separate time in their life where they're away and maybe not thinking about elections. What are your thoughts on that? I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, you know, the youth voter issue is a complex one, and the research that's been done on youth voter turnout has showed that actually the problem isn't, say, with university students. We've actually increased the voter turnout of university students. The problem are non-university students. So we have seen a decline in youth voter turnout. At the same time, we've seen an increase in university students coming out. The problem is the gains have been erased by poor and working class youth not participating. So I think that is a very, very serious question from the point of view of equity. Why are these groups no longer participating? And there are all kinds of complex reasons for that, which I go into in some of my research. I think there's lots of things that we could do in a kind of Captain Canada sort of way to involve our young people with politics more directly. You know, Norway, and Henry Milner's done work on this, Norway has a mini version of the Storting across the street. And all Norwegian students come there and they participate in mock parliaments where they try to get their stuff passed and they have people come over from the Storting. We could ramp that up and roll it out in this country, and I think that would be a really major way of trying to help young people build up their capacities to participate.
And I would ramp that up with a civic education program that restores civics back into our educational systems, because the ignorance is amazing, even for some of you until you get here, probably, of the way our system works. And that's why we're mixing models. And maybe we want to mix models, but we have to be conscious of the fact that as children of Westminster, if we end up in Washminster, we do it by design. So government by referenda, not my kind of government.
I think lowering the voting age is a good thing, but I think it, again, misses the symptom for the cause, and that is younger people aren't voting for a reason, and lowering the voting age to 16 encourages that habits of the heart that's very important. We know that once people vote, they continue to vote, so that certainly has a beneficial effect. But the other 2 things I would mention are things that have just been mentioned, and that is increased civic education, and also empowering organizations like Student Vote, who do the kind of work about civic education in high schools at the grassroots level to facilitate and encourage that conversation about youth engagement.
Well, I find that fascinating. So lowering may not necessarily be the only option. There's a lot of other things that we should be doing. Civic engagement, I think, is most important. Thank you. Do I have time?
Well, yeah,
4 minutes, I was finding that.
Well, no, you have about a minute.
I have a minute. Okay, great. How about new Canadians? I really want to get into, because civics isn't going to answer that necessarily. I think that, however, that is important. Well, how do we deal with educating new Canadians?
I think it's partially the same answer. Civic education for new Canadians is their opportunity. They may have come to us because of our model of governance. We don't know that, right? When my parents emigrated from Italy, when I was born in Italy, you know, I was steeped in what the Canadian model would look like, right? But if you're not in search of it, you're not going to find it. Therefore, the state's desire to inform people as much as possible on these matters means that we need special civic outreach programs for people who come to us later in life, already at voting age, become Canadian citizens, and then are part of the family fabric of what Canada becomes. There's an educational and a civic component there. Because again, it's not just about voting. It's how you participate in our democratic institutions, which is more than just exercising the franchise. So special outreach to those communities as well.
Thank you very much. If I may just add at the end, I know that I'd like to do a shout out to two high schools in my riding, St. Thomas High School and Lindsay Place High School, who hold Model United Nations every year. And it's really fascinating to see how keen the students are and how much they learn about world issues. And I also think that when MPs are invited into the classroom to talk about their work, I've always found that students extremely interested and riveted in many cases. And I also, thirdly, I believe it's very important for schools to come to Parliament and witness a question period. They find it interesting, even exciting, and I think that all dovetails with what you're all saying about the need for more civic education. So thank you for the panelists. We had a great panel, a great debate. It clarified many points of view, and thank you for being here in the last week of July when you could be somewhere else, obviously. So, okay. Merci beaucoup, et on se reprend. Monsieur.
Thank you very much. I have Mr. Reid who wanted to make a comment.
Committee would be discussing Minister Dion's refusal of her invitation to come to this committee. When is that subcommittee scheduled to happen?
I don't have a specific date, but we could set something up. We could set something up for when we come back on the 22nd.
Okay. I'd have to make reference to something happening in camera. Is there not a possibility of doing it earlier than that?
Well, it's just that we don't meet again until the 22nd as a committee, so members won't be here physically until the 22nd. So I think that might be the best time. But
could I make the request that you, as our chair, approach the minister, and between now and when the committee meets,
Chair? Point of order. This is not a point of order. It's a point of information.
That's true. That's true. The first point, I think, was a point of order, but.
Procedurally, I'm not sure what this is. I'm not sure if Ms. Romanato is trying to prevent me from saying something. If that's the case, she could articulate it that way. But what I wanted to say is, I wonder if you could write a letter on behalf of the committee asking Mr. Dion if he could express to us what reasons have kept him from appearing. In particular, if it's a scheduling issue that is the problem, then we could then, at our subcommittee meeting, address the issue of trying to provide or recommend to the main committee an additional meeting at which he could be accommodated.
I don't think it's a point of order, but I'll consider your request. We did invite the minister, and he did provide a response. But I will consider your point, and as I say, we'll try to schedule a subcommittee meeting for the 22nd of August. We also, I think, will have to hold an in-camera meeting of the whole committee to discuss another motion. Is that correct? Around the 22nd? Yeah. So we'll start planning these meetings. Thank you, and thank you to everybody, and thank you to the committee members and the witnesses. We'll see you soon. What's that?